Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. If you're on Zoom, if you could maybe just give a thumbs up or post in the chat, letting me know that you can hear me, that would be great. But welcome, thank you all for joining us today for our UNC Injury Prevention Research Center Visiting Speaker Seminar. We're going to have a presentation today from Dr. Renee Johnson from Johns Hopkins University. And this seminar is just one of several different educational events that we host here from UNC IPRC. And the purpose of this is just to really give space to highlight work and research being done by researchers and practitioners working to prevent injury and violence. So we're really thankful for you all joining us today, and I'm going to pass it to our director, Dr. Steve Marshall, who's going to give a quick welcome from our center and introduce Dr. Johnson.
Really appreciate it. It's a great pleasure to have Dr. Renee Johnson here today. For those of you who've been around injury prevention circles for a while, this is Dr. Renee M. Johnson. I know that it gets confusing, but having someone who used to work in a related space at CDC, but this is Dr. Renee M. Johnson. She's an associate professor, vice chair for diversity, equity, and inclusion in Department of Mental Health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, which is another school of public health just up the road from here. And she earned her MPH and PhD in this institution, which is the University of North Carolina Gillings School of Global Public Health, which obviously is a really good school of public health, and went on to conduct postdoctoral studies at, I guess she wanted to collect all three. So it was, if you keep going further beyond Hopkins, there's another place up there called Harvard. So at Johns Hopkins, she's core faculty with the Center for Adolescent Health and also the Center for Injury Research and Policy, which is led by our very close colleague, Dr. Shannon Frateroli, who many of us have interacted with over the years, and before that, Andrea Gleason. And so Johns Hopkins and North Carolina have always been almost sister centers, if you will. So I'll get out of the way and let Renee do her presentation. She has had a really outstanding career in substance use among adolescents and young adults, the interaction with violence and injury prevention, and also how we respond to, guess what, our escalating problems with closing on 100,000 overdoses, fatal overdoses a year in this country. And what really is important, I think, is that we continue to build the field. I'm looking at Carol and Des Runyon, who have dedicated their careers to building our field. And Renee, likewise, has done a lot of mentorship and a lot of training for the next generation of public health professionals, which extends to teaching a course on substance use epidemiologies and directing or co-directing. You're the sole director now on the NIDA funded training grant for postdocs and doc students. So, and serving as deputy chair for the DRPH program. When do you sleep, Renee? So she's going to speak to us today about post-mortem toxicology results from drug overdose decedents in Maryland, which is a very applied piece of research that she's been conducting, and seen it a few times on the data science presentations, and really look forward to you sharing your results here today. Thanks.
Hello to folks in the room and online. What do you need?
I just need to reshare it on Zoom. So sorry.
Oh, I can do that. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. I think I got everything. It's great to see you, and it is great to give an in-person talk. So thanks for coming, and hi to everyone on the internet. I'm happy to be here. Being here feels like coming home, and in a way, this is really where I did a lot of growing up and sort of learned to think. And I learned, this is where I learned about the science and practice of injury prevention. So thanks for having me. My talk today is going to be on postmortem toxicology, but the theme is really focused on how do we use existing data to understand what's coming in the future. So of course this doesn't work. So when I was preparing this talk, I thought, what should I wanted to just start with acknowledgements, and I started thinking about my pathway to coming to UNC. I was a college student and I took my first course in public health at Morehouse College with Dr. Bill Jenkins. He was a big figure in public health and a trailblazer as an activist, and along with colleagues, brought an end to the Tuskegee syphilis study. He always talked to us about the importance of having Black folks in public health and at the table. And as a UNC alum, of course, he encouraged me to come to UNC. So that was a goal of mine. And I applied to a program called the SPGRE, Summer Pre-Graduate Research Experiences Program, and came here in 1995. I worked with Carol Runyon, and I was literally going through death investigation data. And this was before medical examiner data was computerized. So I just sat in a room with people and just kind of checked off information, and that was used for child death review. So I'm not sure, I don't think you still have the SPGRE program, but those of you in the room who are faculty, pathway and pipeline programs work. So I hope you have programs similar to that. And interestingly, I am still working on death investigation. I think that's how academic careers go. You sort of start in one thing and do it in many different ways over the course of your career. So I'll be talking about homicide death investigation. So back in the early 2000s, I worked with Carol Runyon and Steve Marshall on a project called the State of Home Safety in America. And this was way back when Steve was an assistant professor. As part of this project, we reviewed data on unintentional home injuries. And the idea was really to understand what's going on with unintentional home injuries, what are people dying from? And we reviewed multiple data sets, including the National Vital Statistics System. So this table on your left is NVSS data from 1902 to 1999. And what you will see is that the second leading cause of unintentional home injury death is poisoning. Now, as a grad student, when I thought of unintentional poisoning, I thought of kids swallowing dish detergent or things like that. I didn't really know much about drugs at all. And I didn't understand this finding, and I didn't actually pay attention to it. This was before, it's hard to even imagine, but this was before overdose was a constant, term and public health issue that we're all thinking about. I actually went to PubMed and looked at, 2004 opioid overdose to see how many articles came up. 38 articles came up in 2004. That's the extent to which it was not on our radar. But what that sort of taught me was we were at the precipice, the beginning, the emergence of the overdose crisis. We had data in front of us, and I don't think I did anything with it. So part of the lesson I would love for you all to take from this is that when you are looking at data, think about what it might show you about what the future might hold. So just going back with this theme of the emergence of the overdose crisis, where was I and what was I learning in injury back in the late 90s? Unintentional injuries, this was just something you heard a million times. Unintentional injury is the leading cause of unintentional injury is the leading cause of death for people aged 1 to 44. And another mantra in injury science at the time was motor vehicle crashes are the leading cause of unintentional injury death. That just was something I never thought would change. And it didn't until, decades later. And I had a student tell me that overdose was a higher cause of death than motor vehicle crashes. So by 2015, we see the first time poisoning is the leading cause of unintentional death, not motor vehicle crashes. And you could say to yourself, well, maybe there were few, we got really good at making safer cars, or motor vehicle crash deaths declined, but that really wasn't the case. What happened was there was an increase in poisoning deaths, and poisoning deaths had an increasing share of unintentional injury deaths. So poisoning really begins to emerge as a problem in the sort of early 2000s. And those poisoning deaths were driven by drug overdose. So today, unintentional injuries continue to be the leading cause of death for people aged 1 to 44. And they contribute to more years of potential life lost than any other health issues. And far and away, it's poisonings that are contributing to this unintentional injury problem. Unintentional injury, drug overdose is now a major priority for the Centers for Disease Control and the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control. Their goals are to prevent overdose, to prevent fatalities when overdose occurs, and to ensure that overdose survivors have the services they need. Okay. So many of you have seen this slide many times. It's the CDC's slide of the 3 waves of opioid overdose deaths over time. And these are age-adjusted opioid overdose death rates. Wave 1 sort of begins in 1999 with prescription opioid overdose deaths. And this was following the introduction of prescription pain medications, including OxyContin, into the drug market. I didn't even know what OxyContin was at the time. And I think that that is one reason that injury prevention professionals were a little bit late to the overdose crisis, is because we didn't have the training, we didn't consider it as much a core competency to understand drugs and medication. So my call to injury professionals is we need to consider understanding drugs and medications as part of what we do in our field if we are to be effective prevention scientists. So around 2010, that was when heroin sort of started to take off. And then you see around 2016, that is right at the cusp when the overdose crisis became all about fentanyl, all about the synthetic opioids. So I know many people have seen this graphic over and over again, but what I want you to take away from it now is this idea that we've constantly been chasing the overdose crisis. We, by 2016, had sort of just gotten on top of prescription pain medication, put out guidelines on safe prescribing, did academic detailing. There was a big report sponsored by Gates Foundation or something in 2016 or 2017. So we had gotten a handle on one issue. And while our heads were focused in this direction, this whole other thing started happening with synthetic opioids. And they just took off, and it is unprecedented. There was more than a 400% increase in overdose deaths in just 18 years. So this has now become the public health crisis of our lifetime. As of 2022, preliminary data from National Vital Statistics System suggests that there will have been more than 100,000 opioid overdose deaths. And illicitly manufactured fentanyl is really driving this epidemic at this point. So for 20 years, we've been chasing this issue, and it's time to get ahead of the curve. So what's the current status right now? There's evidence that there's a fourth wave of the overdose crisis, moving away from focus on opioids as a contributor to overdose and toward multiple drugs, polydrug overdose. Some of the drugs that we're noticing are stimulants, including cocaine and methamphetamine, the benzodiazepines, including Xanax, Valium, Klonopin, and then other emerging drugs, including xylazine and gabapentin. And I know Catherine's working on gabapentin. So what I think that we can and should be doing is using the resources and data that we have now to understand what's coming. We can't drop anchor and just keep working on fentanyl because something else is coming down the road. And so with that all as background, I wanted to just share two studies. I led the evaluation of Maryland's Overdose Data to Action program. Overdose Data to Action is a CDC initiative. Now all states are funded, but in its previous iteration, it was just a select number of states and jurisdictions. Overdose Data to Action supports collection of high quality, comprehensive, and timely data on overdose morbidity and mortality. And the purpose of it is to collect those data and then use them to inform prevention and response. And this is the cooperative agreement that I worked with Maryland Department of Health with. That's the number. So one thing that OD2A did in all of the funded jurisdictions was support development of data systems. So now we have a data system called SUDORS, or State Unintentional Drug Overdose Reporting System. And it's sort of made in the shape of NVDRS, National Violent Death Reporting System. Basically, we have learned in injury that you can look at information from people who have died and understand something about the phenomena that you want to address. So there's more information about SUDORS. This is Maryland SUDORS. SUDORS includes all overdose deaths that took place in the state of Maryland with a drug-related cause of death. Alcohol is included as a cause of death only if a decedent had a drug-related cause of death. And like NVDRS, SUDORS pulls data from multiple data systems, including medical examiner reports, death certificates, law enforcement narratives. And there is also information on toxicology screening. And I would like to acknowledge my collaborators at Maryland SUDORS, Cliff Mitchell, Georgette Levetsky, Grace Douglas, and Carly Petrie, who do a lot of hard work abstracting all the information from the multiple data sources to generate this great resource that we have. Okay, so the first little study that I wanted to talk about was drugs and drug combinations. And why we did this was because a lot of overdose data looks at the causes of overdose, and it'll just say, you know, number 1 was opioids, number 2 was cocaine, number 3 was blah, blah, blah. But people don't just use one drug. People don't die from overdose because of just one drug. So when you do these sort of single any drug rankings, you miss the combinations. So what we decided to do was look at drugs and drug combinations and rank them to understand what was sort of driving overdose in Maryland. And yes, okay. So this is the ranking of drugs and drug combinations for all overdose decedents in the state of Maryland in 2020. There were 2,700 people. This is actually restricted to those 18 and older. So the first line is opioids only as a cause of death. So 41.2% of overdose decedents in the state of Maryland in 2020 had only opioids as a cause of death. And most of those opioids were illicitly manufactured fentanyl, more than 86%. In Maryland, we don't have a ton of heroin anymore. I know that's not the case everywhere, but there's very little heroin. So then the second cause of death was actually a combination. It was opioids and psychostimulants. So more than 1/4 of people who died from overdose in Maryland in 2020 had both a psychostimulant and an opioid as a cause of death. So we know that most of the opioids are fentanyl. The next question was, what are most of the stimulants? And cocaine was the predominant stimulant used or listed as a cause of death in opioid psychostimulant deaths. Now, this is interesting because this is not the case everywhere. Out west, methamphetamine is much more common. In Tennessee, these numbers would look really different. Drug culture and the mixes of what people use varies across locales, which makes it really important to have a system like SUDORs that you can use to look at the national picture, the state picture, and then smaller local areas, and then sort of compare. Another thing that you could do with that data is sort of look at your neighboring cities and states and see what's happening in Maryland and in Baltimore City. What is happening in Philadelphia gives us information about what might be happening down the road in Baltimore and vice versa. So it's important to talk. And if we have a simple way to sort of rank drugs and drug combinations like this, then we can sort of compare easily across areas. So very little methamphetamine in overdose in Maryland. And the third ranking was opioids and alcohol. So this sort of reminds me, we forget about alcohol. Alcohol is a real substantial contributor to injury problems and violence problems. And it's easy to forget that in this era of opioids and drug overdose. But it's important to continue to remember that, you know, alcohol is still doing lots and lots of damage. About 10% had alcohol and opioids as a cause of death. Oh, wait. Okay. Okay, so all the other combinations. So this is a cute little table, right? This started out as a giant table. We looked at every single person in this data set and had like pages and pages of all of the different combinations and then whittled it down. So more than 75% of the overdose decedents had 3 drug or drug combinations contributing to their death. Opioids only, opioids and psychostimulants, or opioids and alcohol. Less than 25% had all of the other causes of death. And I will say, can I use the pointer? Yes. This 5.3% is alcohol and psychostimulants. So that is probably, you know, cocaine and alcohol as causes of death. And this 4.4% is it's a class of drugs called sedative hypnotics. And far and away, benzodiazepines are driving the sedative hypnotic overdose deaths. Okay. So that's my drugs and drug combinations study that we did, and that's out for review, so you can read it in a journal soon, I hope. And then the next little study that I wanted to talk about is about this drug called xylazine. Xylazine is an interesting drug. It's considered an emerging drug, but it's been around for a while. Back in the 60s and 70s, people were conducting clinical trials to see if xylazine might be a good sedative for human use. And what they found was that it was very dangerous. It contributed to respiratory depression. So it was never used for human purposes and never scheduled in terms of the Controlled Substances Act. It popped up in overdoses over, the next couple of decades. And then I think in the 80s or 90s, it was in Puerto Rico. It does have legal and approved uses in veterinary science. So it's used as a large animal sedative or a euthanasia agent for cats and dogs. It has been emerging over the past 10 years across the US and not systematically in all cities. Philadelphia, Chicago, now it's popping up in Baltimore. And there are a lot of challenges with xylazine. One challenge is that it's not an opioid. And the reason that's a challenge is because the best tool we have in our tool belt is naloxone, which is a drug that can reverse an overdose. So now if you have people who are overdosing and you give them naloxone and it doesn't work because it doesn't respond, then that means this really wonderful tool that we have becomes less effective on the population level. The other concern about xylazine is that it contributes to skin and soft tissue infections. And, we do know that folks who inject drugs get skin infections sometimes. But what's tricky about xylazine is that the infections happen not necessarily at the injection site. So it's not an issue with your needle being not sterile and causing an infection, but rather it's the mechanism of the drug. Does something I do not fully understand. Somebody explained it to me, but somehow skin has a way of breathing and things that are in the body that need to get out of the skin are able to, and xylazine interrupts that. So you start to develop this terrible necrotic tissue that's very painful. And people who use drugs and then also have skin and soft tissue infections, there's a lot of internalized stigma. It's hard enough to get treatment, but when you have this awful wound, it's just really embarrassing. And we don't have the clinical infrastructure to deal with people who use drugs and have skin and soft tissue infections in clinics, because that's a serious dose of antibiotics and treatment that folks need for those infections to be resolved. So, between COVID and gun violence and the overdose crisis, xylazine represents another potential public health threat that we should all really be thinking about and worried about. A lot of the emerging drugs are just sort of like a different formulation of opioids, parafluorofentanyls and things like that. But xylazine represents something different that we should really start thinking about. So in Maryland, we did look at xylazine in the postmortem toxicology of opioid overdose decedents. And we focused this work on opioid overdose decedents because nearly all of the time, folks who have xylazine in their postmortem toxicology have opioids as a cause of death. We do not have the needed scientific knowledge to understand when xylazine is a cause of death versus when it's not. So if you think of alcohol and how a medical examiner might make a determination about whether it contributed to the death, we know those numbers really well. We know how much alcohol in your blood will kill you. And we're just not there with xylazine. And what we do know about xylazine is that it varies quite a lot. When you look at the toxicology of people who have died and have tested positive for xylazine, they could have, 2 nanograms per milliliter or 400. So more work needs to be done in that area. And I say that because I'm not saying xylazine is a cause of death here. I'm saying xylazine in the postmortem toxicology. So we looked in 2020 and found that 17% of the opioid overdose decedents in the state of Maryland were tested positive for xylazine. Did pretty simple demographic analyses and found out that white and Black decedents were more likely than those in the other race ethnicity category to have be xylazine positive. No sex differences, but it does look like 25 to 55-year-olds were more likely to be xylazine positive. Then among those who died from opioid overdose and who were xylazine positive, we looked at the different drugs and drug combinations in their toxicology. 43% had opioids only as a cause of death, and more than 90% of that was fentanyl. The second highest group, 31%, was the psychostimulants in opioids, and those psychostimulants were by far mostly cocaine. Then opioids and alcohol, and all other. And then this slide shows xylazine positive compared to xylazine negative folks with regard to some drug use circumstances, including fentanyl and or heroin. Really no difference, but pretty much everybody who dies of an opioid overdose has fentanyl as a cause of death, fentanyl or heroin as a cause of death. So we don't see a big difference there. We did see a big difference with regard to evidence of injection, whereby xylazine positive folks were more likely than xylazine negative folks to have had evidence that they were injecting drugs. And how they get that information is there might be in the police report information that there was a syringe next to them or needle marks on their body. And then the other variable we looked at was administered naloxone, which I was interested in, but there's no difference between those, thank you, who were administered naloxone versus not. Okay, so some conclusions from the drug combinations paper. Opioids were the cause of death for 93% of overdose deaths, and fentanyl or illicitly manufactured fentanyl is really driving opioids as a cause of death. More than half of overdose decedents involved at least one non-opioid drug. Cocaine is the most prevalent psychostimulant among overdose decedents in Maryland, and this is different than other locales. Then with regard to xylazine, 17% were xylazine positive in 2020, and this was higher than Sudor's estimates from other states. So it was lower than the city of Philadelphia, but higher than other states that had sort of contributed Sudor's data. We looked at more recent data just to get a sense, and it did increase in 2021, and then it looks like it leveled off. So at least the increase is stopping, but we're still having like 18 to 20 deaths a month, and have the folks in which the folks are xylazine positive. And then xylazine positive decedents usually had fentanyl as a cause of death and were more likely to have evidence of injection. And this evidence of injection is important because that tells you we also have to be thinking about hepatitis C and HIV. So we need to make sure we've got services and things for people who are using drugs, who might have skin infections, who may also have hepatitis C or HIV. And then the last thing, I didn't put this on the slide, is that 118 decedents, or 4%, had sedative hypnotics and specifically benzodiazepines as a cause of death. So that's not dominating headlines in Maryland right now, but it is certainly something to keep an eye on, and it's a good time to sort of think through, do we think this is illicitly manufactured? Or do we think this is diverted from legal markets? Should we be looking at prescribing? What should we be doing? So as we're dealing with these big public health emergencies, COVID and guns and overdose, we also just need to be dealing with these medium public health issues that are not great either. So I'm just going to end with some sort of recommendations to the field and to you all, I guess, in the room is, I think we need to do better in injury at understanding drugs and drug culture. I think we need to use data to forecast challenges. And I know that's been very hard in this time of just constant emergencies. But we need to just devote a little bit of time to thinking about what's coming down the pike as we are dealing with what's right in front of our faces. I think it's critical for folks in injury to be working closely with folks who do substance use research. So I'm talking about, as an injury prevention person, I didn't know OxyContin had hit the market, et cetera. But I've been in a lot of substance use circles as well, and those folks know so little about injury, and death investigation and things. So I think in the same way that we were not prepared for the overdose crisis on the injury side, substance use folks were not prepared either, because they were used to, dealing with substance use disorders and services and behavioral health, but not so much. They didn't have the capacity to set up death investigation systems and do all of the stuff that we do in injury. And then the final recommendation is to partner with local organizations and agencies. There's great work happening if you're in touch with folks who do harm reduction or syringe services programs. That can be a nice opportunity to do ethnographic research or see if you can get a system going where you are getting folks donated drug paraphernalia and testing that. We know what people who have died from overdose, we know the drugs in their system, but we don't know about all the people who are alive and who are using drugs. And we need to, figure out that piece of the puzzle too. So it will be important. And we do in Maryland have a work group to think about emerging drugs and overdose surveillance. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but it sounds like you're doing a lot of that in North Carolina too. So I think that is all the time I have, and I am going to wrap it up, but thank you so much for listening, and I hope you, learned something. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you. Okay. So screen sharing has stopped. Now what we do?
We can leave it like that.
Okay.
And so we're gonna just open it up now for Q&A. So if you have questions, maybe if you could just raise your hand and we'll call you. And then for those in the Zoom, if you can put your questions in the chat, and we'll also make sure that they get answered by Dr. Johnson.
Okay.
So
There are no questions in the chat.
nope, but we have a question in the room.
Oh, hi.
Thanks for the talk. I didn't know much about xylazine, and I just been wondering about the volume of xylazine that's produced in the United States. What pharmaceutical companies? Where is it? Obviously, it's diversion from veterinary, but is that a frontline?
Yeah, I don't know that it's obviously diversion from veterinary folks. I mean, one thing we do know is that veterinary drugs are not as well regulated and maintained as drugs for humans. So if you wanted to divert drugs, it would be easier to do so as a vet than as a medical physician. But there's also some evidence that there's some illicit manufacturing happening. From the drug user side, it looks like xylazine. So we had this move from heroin to fentanyl, and fentanyl feels better, it's more potent, but it has a shorter half-life. So xylazine added sort of increased the duration of effect. So they sort of work synergistically. But on the sort of drug trafficking side, like where is it coming from? I don't think it's like the early days in OxyContin where people were just being prescribed it, or, you know, everybody's getting it very clearly from a legal source. It looks like COVID sort of interrupted some drug trafficking pathways, and folks got it, but it's really unclear. But it does, the best evidence, and I mean, I talked to like the board of vet examiners in Maryland and some other folks, but we just don't know where it's coming from. But it doesn't look like it's only diversion from veterinary sources. There was one other point I wanted to make about that. I can't remember what it was. It might come to me later. Yeah.
We do have a question in the chat. So Shabar would like to know, well, he says, thank you so much for your talk in North Carolina. It has been pretty difficult to get the toxicology data. And in Maryland, it seems that the story is very different. Have you faced challenges in accessing these data, and how have you worked through them, through the challenges?
So it's really important to me as someone in academic public health to be working alongside folks who are in practice. And it is hard to get data, and I think it should be hard to get data. You should not just be giving data to everyone who knocks on your door. We did have to go through data use agreements. It took almost a year to get the data, and we had to set up a nice set of agreements that we would abide by. But I think it shouldn't just be getting the data. It should be, hey, North Carolina, how can we help you? And how can you help us? Let's work together. It's about building a long-lasting collaboration that should, you know, last longer than NIH grant cycles. So it takes a lot of relationship building. I think sometimes folks in practice, public health, and government, first of all, they're beholden to a lot of political stuff that often we aren't in universities. They've got to like report back to a governor and all kinds of things. So it is actually scary for them to just give their data away, because I could write a paper, and if the governor sees it and wasn't made aware of it ahead of time, that's a real risk. So I think we have to be trustworthy as folks in academic public health, in seeking data and in using data. And I think when we're better at that, it will be easier to get data. But yeah, I mean, it was hard. We had to do a lot. And I will say, I was like, I promise I will keep your data safe and I will be super responsible with it. There was a hack in Maryland, and they got access to all of the state's data. And our data was good. And we're like, ours is good. It's like all the data systems were like down. And the Sudor's team couldn't even get their data. And I was like, we'll send you your data so you can do your work. So it was kind of like, I felt very, you know, happy about that. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. I am a self-professed academic. And my question is related to the one you just responded to. And how is the state using the data to produce with that to drive decision-making, prevention initiatives? Is it too early for that? Have they decided?
No. It is not too early, and I'm glad you asked this question, because I used to do way more like NIH work before the OD2A project, and you know, write these discussion sections, and it was like, I found out this answer and somebody somewhere should do something at some point about this issue. And working with the state, they want to know, okay, what should we do? Because they're very hierarchical. So if I write a data brief using their data, and I write somebody should do something, then they are on paper beholden to doing that thing. So you have to be very clear and very careful about recommendations. And I just thought it was fascinating to see, but you think through this, you draft recommendations, you talk about it, you talk about what's feasible. If it's not feasible, you might say, if it were feasible, this would be a great recommendation. If it is feasible, you sort of write it, get it out there, and then folks might talk to their supervisor and their agency lead and their, all the way up to the governor. And it really does change things. So this xylazine work came out, we did a data brief, we had a couple of meetings, we had a work group. Within a year, there's now, there's the work group, but we just said somebody needs to be thinking about the skin and soft tissue infections. People in harm reduction services don't know a ton about wound care. At the state level, the Center for Harm Reduction Services got money from the state to train nurses, public health nurses, to work in harm reduction organizations to do wound care and help people understand how to keep their wounds clean and when you need to go to the doctor. We have a web page in Maryland for people who used, for researchers too, but just to learn about drugs. I mean, that has a card on it, like, what is xylazine? What should I do? Pictures, all of that stuff. So it got put into practice pretty soon. And then the drug combinations, we had a meeting, a state like overdose surveillance group, to talk about like, what do we do with these data? And our dashboard right now is the single drug causes. So this many deaths were opioids, this many deaths were cocaine. And now we are considering using the drugs and drug combinations ranked together so we can understand how it changes. So getting the information out there. And in Maryland, we have 24 counties. North Carolina has a lot more, but each county has an opioid intervention team that is staffed by someone from the health department and someone from emergency management. And so we, as this, working with the state's overdose surveillance team, gets that information out to folks in every county. Folks in every county do what is right for their county. So it actually, action happens quite fast. It's important to have some centralization, like having some central agency that sort of oversees overdose and then is able to get that out to local health departments is important.
We have another question in the chat. So this is from Kurt, who thanks you for the presentation, and he'd like to know, how complete are the toxicology data in suitors? So if there are overdose deaths with unspecified substances, how are those accounted for?
I mean, I just don't think that we have too many unspecified substances, but I think that would be a very small proportion. But I think if it started to be a bigger proportion, we would probably talk to some pharmacologists, get that data and just do an investigation. I think what you can do is share I don't know what the plots are, the chemical plots with other states and get guidance from the DEA to just say, we're seeing this, we don't know what it is, how do we figure it out? We need to just get the chemical composition. And every once in a while, the ME will do an in-depth investigation, and we did that with xylazine. So we did 30 new overdose decedents, and then looked at blood and just learned a lot more than we could. Sometimes people are found dead and have been dead for a long time, and it's hard to understand what happened beyond yes, no, this drug was there, this drug wasn't. So, I mean, I think if there were a lot of decedents with unspecified substances, we'd probably get guidance from National Association of Medical Examiners, DEA, some chemists, and sort of figure it out, but it would be an important question to answer. Carol?
I have two questions. One is,
whether the work groups are coming up with any policy recommendations, either about surveillance or about, say, criminalization or anything else. And then what are the next steps in this line of work?
So for policy recommendations, we did discuss working with our state. So xylazine is not a controlled substance because it is not for human use. And so we discussed whether we should work with the Office of Controlled Substances at the state level to see if it gets scheduled. But we also were like, well, what would that do? So we're sort of like, we didn't make that a recommendation, but we did sort of think through it. It's not a hard policy recommendation, but we did say ongoing monitoring is important. And that recommendation allowed for money to be set aside for this type of work. Like in the same way that faculty, you know, you need 10% effort to work with you on this grant. People in the practice world, like there needs to be a reason that you're going to this meeting. So those kinds of recommendations helped get it out. One policy that I would like to see and that we've been talking about, but we need to work more with hospitals, is a little bit more testing of a broader array of substances in the hospital setting for people who come for overdose and who don't die. And it seems really easy to make that a recommendation, but literally every recommendation you make has so many implications because it could end up costing a lot of money to a hospital. And if you're a hospital with very low overdose and you've got to test somebody and you know they just, you know, drank a lot of alcohol, then it's sort of a waste of money. So somebody has to pay for it. So no other like real firm policy recommendations other than, you know, building the infrastructure, continuing monitoring, you know, include this on formal reports. You know, one thing that was interesting was the reports that come out from the state. You know, the state has to have a rationale for including each drug. And a drug has to like cause this much of a problem for a state for it to be included. And we did get xylazine included on annual vital statistics reports. So, I mean, I guess that's a policy. It depends on whether you call what you mean by policy. Okay, that was your first question. What was your second question?
What are the next steps in this line of work?
Oh, okay. So we are doing xylazine test strips. So those of you who work with drugs probably know what test strips are, but the idea is that in real time, people should know the components of any drug that they're using. So it's a technology issue. You need like to get a team of chemists and whatever to like get a little strip and then test your drugs. And then it says, oh, this is what's in my drug. And then people can opt to not use that drug, not go to that person who sells them drugs anymore, or just make a little bit more of an informed decision. And, you know, I think they show promise. So there's a pilot, we propose to do a pilot of xylazine test strips in Baltimore City. And I don't think I put it on here, but the majority of the xylazine is in central Maryland. So Baltimore County and Baltimore City and Anne Arundel County. So some harm reduction services organizations will be doing that. We also will be doing some in-depth interviews with people who use drugs just to find out, so were you seeking xylazine? Did you want it, or is this a surprise to you? Would you be willing to use test strips to understand what's happening? And I mean, the other next step is to just talk with hospitals. The skin and soft tissue infection is something that really worries me because I have like, it's too long to explain, but sat in a room with a bunch of people in leadership roles in hospitals and was just talking about xylazine. And these were people who don't know about drugs and overdose that much. And it was very clear to me that the capacity for dealing with people who use drugs and have skin and soft tissue infections and need to be like on the floor and get that PICC line and all of that to get their skin back together are not ready for it. Like they don't know the language. They literally don't know how to talk and treat people with active substance use disorders. So I think that's going to take a lot of like working with people fairly high up in hospitals and clinical organizations to get that done. Like the people at the grassroots and communities, harm reduction, syringe services programs were on board. They're like, yes, we want nurses, we want to learn wound care, we're willing to like hand out cards, but I think hospital systems are going to take a longer time to get that infrastructure together. Thank you.
We've got another question in the chat.
Okay.
So this one is from Carissa, and she's asking, how can we get the health department on board? So despite our county having the worst statistics in the state, 3 times the state average, and our health department doesn't provide Narcan, nor have they issued any local alerts, even though they've received multiple confirmatory testing from UNC.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that is hard, and I don't want to get out of my lane because I don't know communications, but I guess I'll step out of it and just say, you know, maybe talk to people who use drugs and people who love people who use drugs in that county, and just, you got to figure out what's happening. So I mean, we had a state like a county like that. I went to a health department meeting and they were like, well, if somebody comes with an overdose, can't we just admit them to the hospital and not let them leave because they're just killing themselves? And I was like, I think that's kidnapping, you know, but they just didn't really know that you're still allowed to leave the hospital if you have an overdose. So, I mean, I guess I would start with people who know you with a positive audience and figure out what's going on, understand the culture, and you've got to just get to a place where it's meeting both of your needs. And figure out what drives them. It is governor and state level mandates also mean a lot. Like a governor's, I never thought twice, like when I was a student, about like, what does the governor say we should be doing? But in states, like people who work for the state, when there's a government mandate, that really makes a difference in getting things done. So a mandate might be, you know, if you know somebody, you can get your cause heard, might be a good way. But yeah, you just got to like build those relationships and understand that it might take a long time, months, or even a year. And just kind of look at the smaller successes that you're having in the interim. So thank you, Carissa. Good luck. That sounds really hard.
Any final questions before we wrap up? In the room or on Zoom?
Okay, thank you so much.